Okay, so in this next section, we're going to talk about how do groups develop? How do collections of people move from being just that to groups? So first, let's understand from an identity perspective, why do we want to join groups? Well, groups and our membership in them have an impact on how we see ourselves in social contexts, how we see ourselves and identify ourselves. You may wear a sweatshirt showing that you attend the University of Akron or that you belong to a certain sorority or fraternity. You may have on your computer various stickers of organizations you support or you are a part of. I know I certainly do. And it's for this reason, or rather, this reflects a reason that we join groups. It shapes our identity. It tells people something about who we are, the groups that we are a part of. And so, in that way, our identity as a person is tied to our membership in different groups. Another thing that happens when we are a part of a group is that if a group does well, we share in that. We feel good about ourselves. I, for one, as you all have gathered, am a fan of the Los Angeles Dodgers. I grew up outside of LA. I've been going to Dodger games since I was an infant. I went to the World Series game in Houston 2 days before my son was born. That's how much of a fan I am. And when the Dodgers won the World Series, it made me feel good about myself because though I am not part of the team, I do identify as being a Dodgers fan. And when my organization, that of Dodger Nation, does well, I feel like I take part in that and I can take pride in being a fan of the Dodgers. This also happens, at a smaller scale. If your sorority or your fraternity is recognized as being one of the campus's best Greek organizations, you take pride in that because you are a part of the entity that is being, you know, um, commended for what they've done. This is, though, unfortunately, also where we get some of our biases against other people from. Our identity is so strongly tied to our groups that we often do a lot to protect that group, to ensure that it has good standing. Because of that, we therefore engage in behaviors, namely discrimination, prejudice, and bias, that harm groups that we are not a part of. It's a very complicated, very convoluted area of research. But generally speaking, being a part of a group has a lot of positive impacts on our sense of self. But our desire to protect that positive sense of self through our group membership by virtue of harming other groups is where we get a lot of problematic things like discrimination and bias. So I just mentioned in-group favoritism. I won't go over it a little too much again, just to reiterate that we favor people who are in our groups over other groups. So we not only see that people can harm people who are not in their groups in order to maintain that positive identity, but they also extend more favor, more positive bias towards members of their groups. So some research that there is an asymmetry here. Some research suggests that people's way of maintaining that positive social identity is not only through harming people who are not in their group, it's also through extending favors and benefits to people who are in their group that they wouldn't give to other people. For example, we find that people are far more likely to help members of their group than they are to help members of other groups, what we would call out groups. So then how do we form this social identity? How do we form this understanding that I am a part of this group? Well, we form social identity first through similarity. We join groups that are with people who are similar to us. And of course, this can operate in terms of demographics, gender, age, etc., but it can also operate in terms of psychological things, preferences, attitudes, interests. There are tons of people in Dodger Nation, and the thing that brings us together is that we all support the Los Angeles Dodgers. I am a huge Star Wars fan. The thing that brings me together with Star Wars fans is our mutual love of a movie. So the things that bond us to a group, the things that we are similar on, are not just demographics. It can be other things too, like common interests and common activities. Groups also offer, though, some distinctiveness. So it makes you A group distinguishes you from other people who don't share in that characteristic that you all share in. And we want to be a part of groups that are distinctive, right? We want to be a part of groups that show that we are different than other people, or that we're special in some way compared to other people. So the reason I am a Star Wars fan, in part, is because it distinguishes me from other fandoms. I'm not a huge Star Trek fan. It's fine, but I'm not like my brother, who has pictures of him cosplaying as a child, as a member of the Next Generation crew, for example. So this makes me and my brother distinct. I'm a Star Wars fan. My cars have Star Wars vanity license plates, and my brother still has kept that cosplay costume for his entire life. And this makes us distinct people and part of distinct groups that are different from each other. Groups also offer us status. So depending on the group that you identify with and are a part of, you receive a certain social status. Some groups have higher status than others. And we do want to be a part of high status groups. So some people do this by trying to be in higher status groups, or some people do this by trying to make their group achieve a higher status. Status, for the record, can also be studied for weeks on end in a groups and teams class, particularly things like social dominance orientation and social dominance more generally. Finally, being a part of a group, the reason why our identity is so precious is because it offers uncertainty reduction. Uncertainty is an experience that human beings want to avoid. Uncertainty referring, of course, to just that feeling of not knowing what's going to happen, what's going on, being unsure. Human beings don't like uncertainty. And so being in a group offers us some way to navigate and understand the world. And when you're a part of a group, it therefore provides that benefit. So we seek to become members of a group because it reduces our uncertainty. Now, how do we become members of a group? There are many models as to how we join as individuals into groups and how we stay in groups. But one very popular model, and I don't believe this is mentioned in your textbook, is known as attraction, selection, attrition. Attraction, selection, attrition, or ASA, articulates how do people become members of groups and stay in them. It first argues that people are attracted to groups with members who are similar to them. So I might be attracted to, if I were a college student, a group on campus of Star Wars fans, right? If there's a club, I will go to their opening meeting, maybe join on a group me or a Discord server to be a part of that group, because I'm attracted to what they do, to the fact that they are also members of this Star Wars fandom. But they also have to select me in. So not all clubs are open, or they may say, oh, we only have a limited number of spots this year, or they might just not offer, links to a Discord server to everyone. So in that way, they also have to select people that they feel are a good fit. Do they feel that I am truly a Star Wars fan? And then we also have attrition. Attrition is where maybe you realize that this group is no longer for you. Maybe everyone said they're a Star Wars fan, but you find that they're just a bunch of fakes. Or maybe they're a little bit too extreme and you realize that you're not as intense of a fan as these people are. So you leave if you realize this group isn't for me. I don't fit in it anymore. The same, of course, can be said for organizations very broadly, and attraction, selection, attrition is also used to understand how people apply to jobs and get hired into organizations and stay or leave organizations. So people who identify an organization that has similar values, for example, may apply to a job there. When they are selected, the HR managers or the supervisors who they will work with will try to identify people who are going to fit into the organization, who do possess the values that they place an emphasis on. And then if the person finds that the workplace that they are a part of does not actually match what they thought it would in terms of their values, in terms of what they want out of work, then they will leave. So this offers an idea also of how groups become more similar over time, because people who are similar are more likely to be attracted to the group. They are also more likely to be selected into the group, be it through hiring or just bringing the person in. And people who are dissimilar, who don't fit in, are just more likely to leave, leaving behind a relatively homogeneous or similar group. Now let's talk about group formation. There are a few models to group formation we're going to talk about too. One that's discussed in your book is this one right here, the forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning model of group performance. This is one, I'm going to move my talking head down here for a little bit so you can see these pictures. This is a model of group formation that we often see in movies. I've listed some over here that maybe you all have seen. Pitch Perfect, Remember the Titans, the original, or not the original Avengers, but Marvel's Avengers. These movies often show this process of group formation. The first step in this process of group formation is forming. The group is brought together, so you have been told you're a group and here's your goal, here's your common purpose. And there's a lot of uncertainty. People test the waters, they start to get to know each other. Then there is a storming portion of the group formation. This is where the groups come into conflict. You realize we are different people. We are not maybe going to get along. We have differences, be they in terms of personality, in terms of intelligence, in terms of demographic experiences, or demographically based experiences. And so that way there's conflict. The storming stage is the conflict stage. And they also resist the constraints of a group. You're taking individuals and putting them into a group, and maybe some of those people don't want to be in a group, which I think we will revisit in a bit. We also then, assuming we get through the conflict portion of the group formation process, then we get to the norming phase. This is where close relationships start to develop. The group starts to develop some level of cohesion, and they start to develop group norms, those understandings of how people should behave and perform. Then we get into the performing phase. This is where the group does what they're supposed to do. Their structure is fully functional, and people have accepted that they are in a group, and they begin to work on the task. And remember the Titans, they have their conflict. They get to a point where all of a sudden they see eye to eye, and then they just start kicking butt and taking names. Now, some groups go through the adjourning phase. As I mentioned, they can go through it right after the storming phase. If any of these phases don't work, they can adjourn at any point. But if it's, say, for example, a task group, you may then get to an adjourning phase where once, the football championship is won and the season is over, then the group adjourns. They have achieved what they needed to, and they can move on. Another way of understanding groups, though, is through the punctuated equilibrium model. Now, the punctuated equilibrium model is a little bit complicated. This argues that these previous stages here, may not happen actually in that order for all groups. And the punctuated equilibrium model argues that there's a first meeting where people set out their goals, the purpose and direction is established, and behavioral patterns and assumptions are made. So basically, it's your first meeting. You get together, you make some plans, and then you all go off and do your own thing. Usually when about half of the time between the first meeting and the deadline is coming up, people basically go into a panic, and their effort and energy level gets ramped up to where they start performing much better. And they may even change what their plans are because they realize, oh no, we haven't done anything. And they have new ideas, new processes, new ways to get their task done. There's actually this final burst of energy that gets them through there, which you can also see right here. Now, some argue that this may be more appropriate for well-established groups, that groups that have well-established groups with well-established norms and routines. So the book, I think, mentions nurses and doctors getting together, though they may be getting together for the first time, because they understand what their roles and the expectations of their performance are based on their occupation. They don't have to go through a lot of what we see here because they know what they're supposed to do, but we still see this punctuated equilibrium model. Others may also argue, though, that this model of group formation is more about how groups tackle tasks. So what do you do in order to get things done? And this is more about the structure of the group and how the structure of the group develops over time, as opposed to how are they getting things done. So we could even think of the punctuated equilibrium model as articulating what goes on here in groups. Now let's talk about some of the downsides to groups. And there are many. So it's important to be aware of what they are, because in organizations you often find that they resort to team-based structures when it doesn't make sense to do so. Conflict is the biggest potential downside to being in a group, though it is a double-edged sword, which we'll talk about in a second. Conflict is a process in which one party perceives that its interests are being opposed or negatively affected by another party. That I believe is from Robbins and Judge, which is an organizational behavior textbook. The point here is that in order to have conflict, you must have two or more parties, so two or more people, two or more groups, two or more organizations, and they must have opposition. So they must have a difference in their interests that can pertain to goals, values, aspirations, etc. So it's a very broad concept of what conflict can be. It doesn't also, for the record, have to be explicit physical violence or even verbal attacks on a person. You and I can be in conflict if we have divergent or directly conflicting goals and aspirations. So for example, a manager could be in conflict with his subordinate if the manager is trying to get a sale from the same client. They're both trying to land the same client. Then they are in conflict because they actually have the same goals, but they both can't achieve those goals. That's an example of where we might have conflict. We could, of course, also have interpersonal conflict, people who have different values. Someone in an organization could be very conscientious, very very good at time management, very responsible. And then you could have someone else in an organization who's low in conscientiousness, can't get anything done, is a total hot mess. Those two people will be in conflict because their personalities will lend them to have disparate interests or different approaches to getting things done. So conflict is a very broad tent term here in psychology. Now, there are many different forms of conflict. Task conflict is about or refers to when people disagree about how to get things or what it is they're doing. Sorry, excuse me, that's the next one. Task conflict is where we disagree about what is it that we're doing? What are our goals? What is the nature of the task that we're supposed to be doing? So you, for example, could work on a group project in your organization, and your first meeting may be all of you in conflict over what it is your group is supposed to do. Some of you may think, for example, that your supervisor has brought you together to develop a new product, whereas others in your group may say, no, we've been brought together to revamp a previous product. That would be a form of task conflict. What are your goals? What is the nature of what you're doing? And do you disagree on what those are? Then there's process conflict. This is just, we disagree about how to get it done. So let's say we all agree we're supposed to develop a new product, but then we disagree about how can we develop a new product? Some people may say, let's do focus groups. Other people may say, let's go investigate our competition and what they're doing. That would be a form of process conflict, a disagreement about how we should get our task done. Then there is relationship conflict. Relationship conflict is just interpersonal conflict. Do you and I have differences that are based on our individual traits, our psychological differences like personality, our demographic differences like ethnicity and race? Those sorts of things, the things about us as people, not what we're doing or how we're going to do it, but who we are as people. And then there's legal conflict, which is just exactly what it sounds like. It's when you're in legal action against another person. So when, say, an employee sues their organization. Now, generally, research would suggest that conflict is not good for organizations and teams. The reason for this generally is that conflict distracts from getting your work done. If you and I are in conflict, you know what we're not doing? Our jobs. So you want to minimize conflict to some extent, is what some people would argue. However, some research, namely O'Neill et al., which I believe is also cited in your textbook, suggests that different types of conflict may be beneficial for groups. So they looked at conflict profiles. You don't have to know what these are, but they generally found that you can have task conflict dominant teams. So teams where task conflict, that conflict over what it is we're doing, what are our goals. They found that there were those teams over here on this side, and then we have dysfunctional teams, those teams that have all types of conflict, process, relationship, and task conflict. So under task conflict dominant teams, so teams where they were only disagreeing about what the task was, what they should be doing, they found that that actually was beneficial because it produced a deeper understanding of the task. It led to a deeper and more critical examination of the assumptions that the group had, and it led to, yes, divergent thinking, but that divergent thinking led them to optimize their performance. Now, task conflict is only beneficial when the other forms of conflict are low. So when we're not also dealing with conflict over who we are as people and how we're going to get the task done. Dysfunctional teams, on the other hand, were just a hot mess. These teams where they had all kinds of conflict, they couldn't function. They couldn't get the tasks done. They were too distracted by their conflict. And so they found that team potency and cooperative conflict management was best in these task conflict dominant teams. In other words, performance was better when you only had task conflict dominant. So what this leads us to believe is that maybe we can leverage conflict. So conflict, as I said, some people believe that we should avoid it because it ultimately leads to a distraction from our work. We're not getting stuff done because we're not getting stuff done. We're too busy talking. We're too busy arguing. However, conflict can be beneficial, much like diversity can be beneficial, because we can leverage different perspectives. We can engage in a critique of our assumptions and therefore optimize our performance. So some people argue is that some people argue is that we should manage our conflict. We can be strategic about our conflict. So some of the ways we can do that is by stimulating conflict. For the record, a lot of this conflict stuff, as I mentioned at the top of the previous video, is not in the textbook. So we can stimulate conflict through communication. We can use ambiguous messages, so messages that aren't clear, to get people to think about, okay, well, what is it that we're doing? Do we all understand it? To ask questions, to be more insightful. So if we actually keep our communication vague, that can generate conflict, and in a way that's good. We can also bring in outsiders. So bringing in outsiders brings in new perspectives that, yes, can create conflict, but therefore can also lead to greater creativity and, as I keep saying, more optimization of our outcomes. We can also restructure. So if you change the structure of a team, say put a new leader in place, that can lead to conflict. But that conflict can actually lead people to change their assumptions about who should they listen to and who should we be talking to and whose ideas should we be paying attention to. And it can disrupt the status quo in a way that can be really beneficial for the functioning of a group. Finally, you can also bring in a devil's advocate. I love the idea of the devil's advocate for a number of reasons. But before I get into that, let me talk about what a devil's advocate is. A devil's advocate is someone whose job it is to constantly challenge and question the assumptions, the ideas, and the plans of the group. The reason I love a devil's advocate is because it gives someone the protection of having the role to defend themselves against people getting angry about their critiques, because some of us are contrarians. Some of us are the person in the group who can be also labeled as a Debbie Downer or a wet blanket, the person who's always saying, well, that is a bad idea, or have you thought of it this way, or why are we doing it this way, or do you think this is the best path forward? People may get frustrated with that person. They may get angry. They may say, why are you trying to keep us from getting our work done? When you have a devil's advocate and that person actually has been appointed as that, they can say, hey, this is what I've been appointed to do. If you have a problem with it, then take it up with the person or group that appointed me. So that way it provides them the protection that they need to be effective in being a devil's advocate and not having to worry about people or not having to worry about backlash, rather. So these are some of the ways that we can manage conflict, because conflict sometimes can be beneficial. It can lead to creativity. Of course, we don't want so much conflict or the types of conflict that can lead to people or groups not doing their work. We want the conflict that can lead to creativity, to innovation, to better performance. Another way to manage conflict is also through something known as dialectical inquiry versus consensus. So here we can strategically generate conflict in the groups that we lead or manage. And we can do this by virtue of the parameters or the guidelines that we give groups for how they should orient their discussions. So in this study, what they did is they instructed some groups to aim for consensus, so to aim for agreement, basically, on what they would do and how they would do it. In other groups, they told them to engage in something known as dialectical inquiry. So dialectical inquiry being when they encourage people basically to engage in arguing. They were told them, you should be challenging people. You should be asking questions, going in a back and forth. If someone proposes an idea, there should be questions about it, and that person should have to answer to those. And the person then should have to, then defend their critiques. And there should be a back and forth, basically a structured debate about how the group should function. Now, what happened when groups where conflict was induced and managed, The groups that actually experience dialectical inquiry, so that strategic back and forth of challenging ideas, actually had greater group consensus. And there was also more individual acceptance of decisions, which makes sense because those people were actually a part of the decision and they were able to disagree, to voice their concerns, and not just aim for agreement. So there was more acceptance of the decisions and therefore more satisfaction within the teams. So in this way, if we give our groups the structure to challenge each other's ideas, to engage in conflict in a way that is productive, we can actually see more consensus and more acceptance of decisions than when groups have been directed to just aim for consensus. This is something, for the record, we will talk about again when we talk about groupthink. The last couple of things I want to touch about before I get into group decision making include social loafing. Social loafing refers to when members of a group, because they have been brought into a group, expend less effort than when they are alone. So basically what we find is that people, when we add more and more people to a group, we actually have diminishing returns on productivity. This is why some people argue that you should keep groups reasonably small, because the more people you add to a group, it actually leads you to less productivity than had those people been working on their own individually. The reason for this makes sense, right? If you and I are in a group, then I feel that I no longer have the pressure to be doing things all by myself. I feel like I can give some of the responsibility to you, but I also feel that if I don't do something or something goes wrong, then not all of the blame can be put on me. Indeed, we find that social loafing is far less likely when you have easily identifiable output. So I can point to what someone has done and say, hey, this is your thing and it was garbage, and therefore they have to be accountable to it. And when people are actually directly affected by your work, so you know that someone is going to be impacted by your work, you are far less likely to socially loaf under those conditions. And a lot of you are probably sitting here saying, yes, I've had this happen in group projects where people just don't pull their weight and they don't do what they're supposed to do. Or you've been at work and you say to yourself, I would have been able to do this so much more easily and effectively than had I been put into a group. So this is the downside to bringing people into a group, is that sometimes the returns on the group structure that we would expect don't happen because people disengage, they diffuse, the responsibility becomes diffused among all other people in the group, and people just aren't willing to put forth a ton of performance, especially when they know they can get away with it, which I think we'll talk about in a couple slides. The opposite of social loafing is something known as social enhancement. This is where people will work harder on a more attractive task than they would otherwise. So we can counteract social loafing by putting groups on tasks that are attractive, that if the group does well in the task, they will feel good about themselves. This gets back to some of the social identities stuff that I talked about earlier. So if you're going to put groups onto a task, maybe try to make sure that it's one that is desirable, that if they succeed in it, they will feel good about themselves, because then we will see people actually put forth more effort than had they been working individually. These all relate to two concepts that get addressed in your textbook as well: free riders and suckers. Free riders often emerge when people are social loafing. This is when someone basically does not put forth their fair share of work, but takes their credit or more than their amount of credit. We've all been a part of groups where there's that one person who doesn't do a darn thing, shows up on the day of a presentation and gets the same grade as the rest of us do. That person is a free rider. The risk, though, that a free rider takes is that the rest of the group members won't say to themselves, hey, I'm not going to be taken as a sucker, or taken for as a sucker. Yeah, I'm basically not going to let you take advantage of me. And then they reduce their effort. So the free rider assumes that the people are just going to pick up the slack that they have, left for them. But the sucker effect basically argues that people will reject that and will reduce their effort and say, hey, I'm not going to do more than I need to. So if it means that I fail this, fine, but I'm not going to do more than my fair share because I don't want to be a sucker. So those can be some of the downsides to bringing groups together as well, that people reduce their performance either A, because they're a free rider and they think they can coast off of the contributions of other people, and or B, because the rest of the group then decides that they don't want to be taken advantage of. So I'm going to stop here, and then the next video is going to be about group decision making.